Hello. Hi. Welcome, everyone. My name is Caitlin Alcott, and I'm a member of the River Restoration Northwest Board. And it's my privilege today to welcome this community to a conversation on the topic practicing biocultural restoration. Typically, the River Restoration Northwest community comes together every year during the first week of February. We meet, we share what we've learned in the practice of river restoration to encourage one another to continue to work hard for the stewardship of land and water. We ask questions, we consider new ways to accomplish this life's work that we've set ourselves to. And of course, we meet to reconnect as a community. And today we're doing that same thing, but in a uniquely 2021 fashion, over the computer and each from our own places. As a way of coming together, I know I see a lot of you doing it now. Will you please type in the chat box where you're sitting? For me, I'm in my office on the floodplain of the Columbia River in a place that I usually call Hood River, Oregon. It's about 35 miles downstream from Celilo Falls, which is a place of great spiritual and cultural importance for Native people, including Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs, Yakama Nation, Cowlitz Indian Tribe. The phrase biocultural restoration, which is defined by Robin Wall Kimmerer, who we'll hear from soon, is the science and practice of restoring not only ecosystems, but human and cultural relationships to place, so that the cultures are strengthened and revitalized, along with the lands, along with the lands to which they are inexorably linked. This idea of restoration as integrating the ecosystem and the people who are linked to the land makes intuitive sense to me. As a mom, I'm seeing my kids' bodies and spirits grow interwoven with the place that's our home. And as a river ecologist, I know that every river and landscape that I spend time on teaches me more and more. However, what I also know is that I have much to learn about how to do this. This afternoon, we get to hear from 5 people. 1 is a newcomer like me and 4 Indigenous experts on what it means to do restoration in this way, drawing on millennia of expertise in the work of ecological restoration that's been practiced long before Western science arrived. So these talks are a gift, and I really hope that you'll join me by giving in return open hearts and ears to the lessons that are being shared. My job now is to introduce our intrepid moderator, who is Karilyn Alex, and she's a fisheries biologist and fluvial geomorphologist with Okanagan Nation Alliance, and someone who's working daily in her work life to actively practice biocultural restoration. Karilyn has worked as a fisheries technician and river raft guide while finishing her bachelor's degree at the University of Victoria. She then went on to complete a master's degree through the Canadian Rivers Institute at the University of New Brunswick. Her master's degree was multidisciplinary between fisheries biology and hydraulic engineering, looking at types of flow parameters that impact spawning sockeye salmon. Karilyn's major area of study is river restoration in regards to salmon spawning and egg incubation habitat through the guidance of traditional ecological knowledge. She's been working with the Okanagan Nation Alliance Fisheries Department since 2002 while raising her family. So welcome, Carrie.
Thank you, Caitlin. And good afternoon, everyone. Haskellhold. I'm Karilyn. I will be your moderator for the talks that the River Restoration Northwest has lined up today. I feel a lot of gratitude to be able to spend this afternoon with you all. I live and work on the unceded territory of the Okanagan Tribal Nation. And I would like to start today with an acknowledgement of our country's colonial history, where Indigenous peoples' sovereignty, historic, and current presence on the land has not been respected. Systemic Indigenous racism occurs in many forms, such as the federal Indian policy in the US and the Indian Act in Canada, as well as the residential school systems. These systems established, maintain, and perpetuate power imbalances and systemic barriers that stem from the legacy of colonial policies and practices. In my work, restoring sites on the rivers and creeks in the Okanagan Tribal Territory, we have been on a steep learning curve in finding ways to incorporate traditional ecological knowledge or indigenous knowledge and guidance in our restoration projects. There is no reference manual for this. There's no quick tips online, and it's not a checkbox. For our area, we have found that for restoration projects, It needs to be First Nations community driven and at the smallest scale. It's site specific and sometimes issue specific. It can't be cookie cuttered to other areas. It needs to occur at all levels, from planning through implementation, and it's based on relationships that need to be built and maintained. It is alive, and traditional ecological or tech guidance works regardless of the issues. It works in contemporary issues of today, like climate change, and it also works in historic issues, trying to figure out to fix something that we've lost. We within my group have been doing this for about 20 years, and we are still just at the tip of the iceberg in what we can and need to create. For us, Indigenous guidance has consistently created long-term stable rivers and creeks that support Indigenous fish and wildlife and their ecosystems. In areas where we haven't had enough of that guidance, we've struggled with the projects, but all of the projects that have had thorough Indigenous guidance have been long-term stable. We haven't had to go back and fix them. We haven't had to tweak them. They just function. Tech is not always easy to connect with though. And it's not because it's lost, but because it has been marginalized and resources for rebuilding are needed. To paint a picture of the rebuilding that I'm talking about, I'm going to call on some of my home experiences. I'm not First Nation. I'm a newcomer of Swedish descent, and my husband is tribal Okanagan. We felt early on that our children need to be connected to all of who they are to create in them long-term stable humans, which they're teenagers, so fingers are still crossed on this one. If they want to be immersed in their Swedish background at any point, the Swedish language, the culture, the food, we get on a plane and boom, we go to Sweden and they have a contemporary immersive experience. We currently live on the lands that my husband's ancestors have walked since time immemorial, and immersion is not an option. Just to be connected to Insultion, their Indigenous language, we take language classes. There are less than 30 fluent speakers of Insultion. To be connected to their culture, we work to try and find opportunities for them to attend sweat lodges, winter dances, water ceremonies, and that list goes on and on. These ceremonies have been marginalized, so they're hard to connect with those people that run them because ceremonies were illegal in Canada up to the 1950s, a policy that also existed in the States. So many practitioners have been lost or run underground. To have first foods on our table, salmon, moose, roots, and berries, we prioritize gathering, but first foods still only make up a portion of what we eat. So my ancestors were very much a part of our history of systemic Indigenous racism, even if all they did was look the other way. Rebuilding is every bit worth the effort, but it has been an unlevel playing field. We can make spaces for the diversity of voices, and today's talks offer us the opportunity to rethink what we think we know. To be a part of starting these discussions, the speakers today and the River Restoration Northwest have created this space. The format for the afternoon's event is that we'll have 4 speakers. Keynote speaker, Dr. Robin Wall Kimmerer, followed by Gabe Sheoships, will be giving talks on biocultural restoration and the extensive knowledge that exists in Indigenous communities in regards to restoration practices. We will take a 5-minute refresh break and start promptly with a continuation of talks from Charlie Reed and Brittany Arona, who will be sharing their knowledge about the original scientists, spoiler alert, the Indigenous peoples of the Americas, as well as grassroots movements that are led by First Nations. There are opportunities to send questions to the speakers by using the Q&A button located at the bottom of your screen. You can send questions at any time during the talks or after the talks, and your questions will be used during the Q&A panel session at the end of the presentations. If you are having any technical difficulties, please let us know via the chat line. And today's event, just so that you know, will be recorded and posted to the River Restoration Northwest's website so that you can view it later or share with friends and colleagues. Our first presentation today is by Dr. Robin Wall Kimmerer. Robin is the co-founder of the Traditional Ecological Knowledge section of the Ecological Society of America. She serves as a senior fellow for the Center of Nature and Humans. She's a mother, a plant ecologist, writer, and distinguished teaching professor at SUNY, the State University of New York, College of the Environmental Science and Forestry. As a writer and a scientist, her interests in restoration include not only restoration of ecological communities, but restoration of our relationships to land. Robin is the author of numerous scientific papers on the ecology of mosses and restoration ecology, as well as on the contributions of traditional ecological knowledge to our understandings of the natural world. She is also active in literary biology. Her essays appear in Whole Terrain, Adirondack Life, Orion, and several other anthologies. She is the author of Gathering Moss, which incorporates both traditional Indigenous knowledge and scientific perspectives, and was awarded the prestigious John Burroughs Medal for Nature Writing in 2005. Her latest book, Braiding Sweetgrass, was released in 2013 and was awarded the Sigurd Olsen Nature Writing Award. Her interests in restoration include not only restoration of ecological communities, but restoration of our relationship to land, and she lives on an old farm in upstate New York, tending gardens both cultivated and wild. I'm now going to pass the screen time on to Robin for her presentation on restoration and reciprocity. Thank you, Robin, for being here today.
Thank you so much, Carilyn. And hello, everybody. I'm glad that we're able to meet this way, really all across Turtle Island. I want to begin with a traditional protocol greeting. Let me also put up my slides here so you can all see those. Hold on, there we go. Let's just go right here. Hold on. We'll go right there. You should be able to see that now. Good. All right. So we'll begin with a traditional protocol greeting in our language. I'll say to all of you, Bonjour, Jayak, Shabadas Gegish Kokwen Nadeshnakas, Bodwe Wadmikwenda, Megazedo Dem, Minwa Makodo Dem, Syracuse, New York, Nadoch Bia, Shawnee, Oklahoma, Nebendigwes. In our beautiful and highly endangered language, I've told you that my name is Light Shining Through Sky Woman. I'm a Potawatomi woman of the Bear Clan and also of the Eagles. I live here today near Syracuse, New York, and I'm enrolled in the Citizen Potawatomi Nation and our homelands in Shawnee, Oklahoma. I also want to tell you where I am right now. I am sitting almost at the cusp between the St. Lawrence watershed and the Susquehanna River watershed, up on a high piece of land where the divide happens. I am in the heart of Maple Nation, and I am very gratefully in the ancestral and contemporary territories of the Haudenosaunee people. The Onondaga Nation is kind of just over my back hill. And I want to say that on these Haudenosaunee lands, we have to remember that we have this unpaid debt of land, of history, and surely of the practice and the philosophy of caring for land. It is also part of our traditional protocol that we always begin with gratitude. And so I would ask you to cast your mind back to this morning when we first put our feet on Shkakbikwe, on Mother Earth, and to remember that we were given everything that we need. That first breath of morning air, a drink of water, food, companionship, of clouds and geese and trees and rivers. All gratitude to those beings who create the world that sustains us. And though we live in a world that just showers us with these gifts at every minute of our being, we also know that we are harnessed to institutions, both economical, social, and political, that are constantly demanding what more can we take, despite all that we've been given. And isn't the question that we really orient toward is what does the earth ask of us, not what more can we take? I'm so grateful to you all for inviting me to join you today on this topic, which is so important to me, of biocultural restoration. And I also want to say that from the Potawatomi perspective, I am honored to speak on behalf of water. Anishinaabe, our Anishinaabe women carry a special responsibility as life givers to speak for the water. And to look out for the water and care for the water. And so this feels also like an important traditional responsibility that I am happy to hold and to share with you. Because of course, all over Turtle Island, Indigenous peoples all over the world are standing up for our water, standing alongside river restorationists, activists of all sorts, who, like Anishinaabe women, carry the responsibility to care for the water, for the water is life. Here's one of my favorite rivers, the beautiful Wild Wolf River. And when I think about our responsibilities for water, this is what comes to mind, this whole thriving ecosystem, inseparable land, water, and culture. But we know in so many cases our rivers don't look like the Wild Wolf River, that we've done great damage, and our rivers are in need of healing. And that's what brings us together. And I want to say Chimigwech in our language, a big thank you to all of you for the work and the dedication that you put into healing rivers, watersheds, and all the life that depends upon them. And I'm glad to be in solidarity with you in this important work. And you know, when we look at a river like this, we know that sustainability, so-called sustainability, is in question. And to frame our conversation today, let's just remember something about this definition of sustainability. Comes to mind with a story shared with me by a fellow biologist, Carol Crow, who talks about asking her tribal council to go for funds, a travel grant, to go to a conference like this one, to talk about sustainability. And her elder said, well, what is sustainability? And she kind of smiled, thinking, well, that's the way our people have cared for the land and lived here well for millennia. We just never called it sustainability. So she gave them these definitions, familiar to all of us, I know. And the elders looked at this really carefully and considered, and they said, yes, you can have that travel grant. We want you to go to that meeting, but we want you to carry a message with you, because they had carefully thought about these definitions of sustainability, ways of ensuring future generations' ability to continue to live in a good way. And they said, that sounds to me like they're just trying to find a way to keep on taking. It's always just taking. It's not our right to keep taking. When your feet hit the ground in the morning, you should be thinking about, what is it that I can give? And this powerful reframing of even the well-known term of sustainability gives us an idea of the power of reframing that which is familiar to us as ecologists and environmental scientists through an Indigenous lens. And that's what I hope to do today, so that all of us can consider, in return for the gift of rivers and all that they bring to us, how can we as human people reciprocate the gift of rivers with gifts of our own? What are those gifts, and how shall we use them? They're probably unnamed multitudes of gifts that that are in this gathering of hundreds of people. What's yours and how will you give it? This is part of a broader philosophical question that underpins much of traditional ecological knowledge, which this broader question of how do we reciprocate the gifts of the living world, be it soil, animals, the trees, the birds. How are we called to give back in return for all of that? And traditional ecological knowledge is rich in such prescriptions. If we had to characterize anything that in a tiny little abstract, a haiku of what is TEK, it's about reciprocity. It's how do we give back? How do we live? What do we do in order to reciprocate the gifts of the world so that all people, the standing people, the swimming people, the two-legged human people, how might we all live here well together? There are so many questions about, or answers, well, and questions too, about what does the earth ask of us and how do we reciprocate those gifts? But of course, pertinent to our gathering here, restoration is one of those answers. We use our healing gifts, we use our science, we use our engineering, we use our art and our design and so much more to do restoration. And what we're going to talk about today is broadening this concept of how we use ecosystem restoration as a form of reciprocity. And these, as Karilyn said so well, we are just emerging and learning how to do this. And I'm grateful to be learning it right alongside you. Now, to begin with, as we think about how we're doing restoration of rivers or of any ecosystem, it depends on what we mean by the land. And I should tell you that by land, I don't mean just terrestrial ecosystems. By land, I mean big L land. I mean the place where we live. I mean home. But our approaches to restoration depends on how you think about what land means. And through the strictly Western lens in which many of us have come up, grown up in a colonial society, been schooled through higher education, the definitions of land are often associated with natural resources, right? That's what land is. It's a source of natural resources. That land is inextricably tied to capital, right? To economic systems, sometimes synonymous. Land as property, where property is a set of rights, right? That we have exclusive property rights to a particular parcel of the earth. And then sometimes we think about land as a source of ecosystem services, those things like water and biodiversity and little things like oxygen. But what if we, before we entertain our questions of restoration, we say, well, what does land mean through a different lens? Not through the Western scientific lens, but through the Indigenous lens. And this is so important, not only to our work as scientific and restoration practitioners, but as citizens. When we remember that all of the lands on which settlers live, work, do restoration, that all of these public lands and indeed private lands are Indigenous lands. They're Indigenous lands that for the most part were illegally taken from their original caretakers. Out of that question then, doesn't our work as doing restoration and thinking about reciprocity in our homelands also become reciprocity as an act of justice, an act of land justice and an act of social justice? That's what we're about, so much more than ecosystem restoration. What if we look at the land through the Indigenous lens, where land is understood as a source of identity, where certainly land is our sustainer, the beings who feed us, provide us with water, who care for us. Land is the residence not only of human people, but all of our more than human relatives. Land as our ancestral connection, both to the past and to our descendants. Land as a library, as a source of knowledge, land as our teacher, as our pharmacy, as our healer, land as inspirited, land as home, land not as property, not as property rights, as a place for which we claim rights, but land as the place where we enact our moral responsibility for life. That's all of this is what land means, because land is sacred. If we look at land through this lens, we're going to do restoration in a very different way. And in the talks that we're going to hear after my introduction, I'm so eager to hear the way that Gabe and Brittany and Charlie are thinking about this. Here in the Haudenosaunee territories where I live, we have many beautiful wild rivers, and we also have deeply harmed waters, such as what you see here, Onondaga Lake, which is the sacred lake of the Haudenosaunee. It is also the site of multiple Superfund sites. We have a situation where the traditional lifeways and the Indigenous worldview was literally buried under 30 feet of industrial sludge. The Indigenous worldview buried by the industrial. So our work in restoration is more than just healing the land and the water. Because when you look at a place like Onondaga Lake or any of the places that you might be holding in your mind and heart, we know that it's not the land that's broken. It's our relationship to land that's broken. Filling a sacred lake with mercury is a sign of a broken relationship. And so we can't only heal the water and the land and the plants and the animals. We have to heal relationship as well. And as a plant ecologist, schooled and practicing scientific ecological knowledge, SEK, I think, and you as well, we know that restoration of relationship lies outside of the tools of Western science. Western science explicitly sets aside values, right? Whereas these issues of biocultural restoration lie at that intersection between values and the natural world. So we need a different way to thinking, not just SEK, but TEK as well. You know, when we're studying Bio 101, right? What do we learn? Is it that fuels biological evolution and adaptation? It's genetic diversity. Well, I think that we need cultural evolution toward true sustainability. What will fuel that? Intellectual diversity, multiple ways of knowing. And as scientists and restoration practitioners, this too needs to be in our toolkit. Two-eyed seeing, as the Roberts have called it, this notion that how much more can we learn about the natural world and our relationship to it if we saw with two eyes, through the Indigenous lens as well as the Western lens. Because again, as biologists, we know what the consequences of monoculture are, right? Instability, eventually reduced productivity, loss of diversity. And so what are the consequences of an intellectual and practice and philosophical monoculture in which many of us have been educated? As restoration ecologists, we're all about defending biodiversity, right? At the scale of genetic diversity, perhaps in our fish stocks, in species diversity, in the watersheds in the riparian corridors, certainly landscape diversity in the mosaic of land types that support a watershed. Shouldn't we also, as restoration practitioners, be concerned then with knowledge diversity? That knowledge diversity which will support our defense of biodiversity. Oop, that slide shouldn't be there. Okay, and the dominant metaphor that I use, I suppose it's because I'm an Indigenous botanist, what I think we're really trying to do here is to plant a garden, like a knowledge garden, modeled after the Three Sisters garden of growing corn, beans, and squash all together. You probably know about this genius of Indigenous science, this polyculture, that by growing these three plants together, they don't compete, they complement one another. They don't try to become one another. The corn doesn't try to become the beans. It's important that they're sovereign, standalone plants, standalone knowledges as well. Could we take a lesson from this polyculture and think about our knowledge garden, where we have traditional ecological knowledge and scientific knowledge growing together, complementing one another? It's not a matter of using one or the other, it's using them both to create much higher knowledge productivity, if you will, so that we all can be fed. And Kenny Ausubel has this wonderful quote. As a writer, this is definitely one of those that I think, man, I wish I'd said that. We're going to need the enduring knowledge of Indigenous science as well as the best of leading edge Western science. It's high tech meets high tech. And that's really what we're about here in doing biocultural restoration. And following the models, as you're about to hear from the other speakers, about innovative means of restoration that are happening in Indigenous nations all over Turtle Island. Just a couple here, slides here to jog your memory. Wolf restoration in Nez Perce lands, Blackfeet people restoring grasslands and bison, forest restoration, salmon watershed restoration that I know a lot of you are part of. So many examples here from my home territory, restoration of Onondaga Lake using TEK as well as SEK. Well, how? You're going to hear more about it, and I can just give you the kind of the smallest little examples here, but TEK is really an important resource in doing ecological restoration. You see a list here of some of the reasons why. Knowledge for reference ecosystems, for land management practices, for alternative ecological models and models of relationship as well. Oops, sorry, let me go back there. I was too fast. Just as we know, and when we're beginning to design a restoration project, we have to identify the reference ecosystem, right? And in some cases, we choose a pre-settlement reference ecosystem. How can we possibly do that as a restoration target without the engagement of traditional ecological knowledge? We also have to consider not only the reference ecosystem, but the reference relationship. Information on defining these reference ecosystems is embedded in SEK. We know how to do that, right? To research what might the reference ecosystem be. But we also need to hone our skills in understanding how TEK informs our thinking about reference ecosystems through oral histories, through harvesting practices, through management practices, through practice of culture. Examples being here, one of the most amazing biodiverse, I think it is the most biodiverse tallgrass prairie on the planet. Biologists come from all over the world to study this place. Why? Why has it been able to maintain its biodiversity when it has dwindled in so many other places? Indigenous land management. The people of Bekeshwanong have an uninterrupted history of fire management. Here's another example of the way that TEK is so vital for identification of the reference ecosystem. A story shared by my dear friend and colleague, Gary Nabhan, a restoration ecologist, who talks about working on restoration of habitat for this animal here, the endangered desert tortoise. And he talks about being out in the field with fish and wildlife biologists trying to identify critical habitat. And he brought along with him his Tohono O'odham colleague who didn't speak a lot of fluent English, but boy, did she know her plants. And so she came along with them. She didn't say much throughout most of the trip. And then they came to one area, a candidate area for critical restoration. And she pointed out the name of the plant that was carpeting the ground there. The name of the plant in the Tohono O'odham language. And the name of the plant was desert tortoise eats it. Indigenous languages as sources of reference ecosystem knowledge and guidance for what the land needs and wants to be. So when we think about restoration philosophy and practice that we're all engaged in, excuse me, we know that the early days of restoration, before it was even called restoration, it was reclamation, right? Maybe some of you remember those days where really it was all about getting something green to grow on some mine waste and calling it good. Fortunately, those days of reclamation were replaced by a more scientifically and ecologically sound ecological restoration in SEK approaches. This is the approach which continues to dominate today. And you know this definition from the National Research Council about the return of an ecosystem to an approximation of the pre-disturbance state, that it's got to restore structure and function. It's not okay that it just looks like an ecosystem, right? It has to function in the appropriate way so that it has ecosystem integrity and longevity. This is a huge step up from reclamation. But let's again use two-eyed seeing and think about another view of ecological restoration. On the left-hand side of the screen, you see some of the hallmarks of what we would call the SEK definition of restoration. Restoration of structure and function. Why? To deliver ecosystem services, right? You know that column pretty well. It's what most of us are engaged in as restoration ecologists. But on the right-hand side of the screen, through the Indigenous lens, you see a statement from the Indigenous Peoples Restoration Network, part of the Society for Ecological Restoration, that puts at the top of their list, the first thing to happen is restoration of relationship to place. A relationship based on respect and reciprocity. How can people be in reciprocity with that land again? And rather than being an engineered, imposed solution in a relatively short time frame, it's the notion of working with the natural intelligence and the other beings of the land to be a partner in these dynamic processes. And it can take, of course, a very long time. The IPRN goes on to say that ecological restoration is inseparable from cultural and spiritual restoration. We're back to that notion of land as the place for whom we bear a spiritual responsibility, not primary rights. And it calls on a partnership between SEK and TEK to be the hands and the heart together doing this work. And so this leads us to thinking about biocultural and indeed beyond biocultural to reciprocal restoration. Moving beyond these strictly SEK approaches, what would it look like if we incorporated Indigenous ways of understanding what land means and to be in relationship to it? So on our evolution of restoration philosophy, what lies beyond what ecological restoration? If we can expand our intellectual frameworks and indeed expand our imaginations into, say, what would it look like if we were using TEK to guide our restoration? You will hear in a few minutes from 3 Indigenous practitioners who will share those stories. So this is a new, more holistic approach to restoration that says, yes, of course, restoration of structure and function, and species composition, but also restoration of relationship between people and place. This is at the essence of biocultural restoration, where it's guided not only by the target of identifying what is the reference ecosystem that we want to heal, but what is the reference relationship that we want to heal as well? And just for those of you who, for whom these ideas about biocultural restoration might be a little new, let me take just a few minutes to talk about kind of the framework for these ideas, and then you'll hear more of it in the stories to come. That term biocultural restoration really was first put forward by Dan Jansen long time ago when he was working on restoration work in the dry forests of Costa Rica. And he said that biocultural restoration requires the involvement of local people as allies in doing restoration, exactly to the point that Karilyn made at the outset about restoration projects that do involve people and cultural knowledge have great longevity, stability, and productivity. Well, moving on from 1988, Karen's also called for some elements of biocultural restoration, that it has input from citizens, not just from scientists, but from the people who use and live in the land, and the recognition that all restoration takes place in a cultural landscape of one sort or another. And John Cairns really had thought about biocultural restoration as a way to create social support for restoration projects. And then we move on to the work of Dennis Martinez and Higgs as well, saying that what do we mean by biocultural restoration? We mean projects that are guided by cultural goals and knowledge of the people who live there. That's TEK, right? The engagement of the cultural goals, values, and knowledge, and that people aren't outside the system, but they're part of the system, which means in order to restore the system, you have to restore the cultural practices that helped create that system. And recently, we just finished, the last semester. My graduate students and I have been working on a class in biocultural restoration. And I want to share with you some of the principles that they all came up with of what biocultural restoration really is. It is a means of enacting reciprocity, both physical and cultural, where the lands that provide for our well-being, we return the gift. We're right back to where we began with reciprocity. That BCR, meaning biocultural restoration, draws on multiple ways of knowing. So we can't just do SEK, TEK, or many practitioners talking now about LEK, right? About local ecological knowledge of people who are embedded in those ecosystems and know them well. And BCR, biocultural restoration, is also a philosophy and practice which incorporates human values that goes beyond the structure and function of ecosystems to guide the reference ecosystem by the values of the people who are involved in caring for that place. A definition that has arisen from some of my writing, and I don't want to just read to you. I give you these quotes as kind of a resting place for some of our thinking. But biocultural restoration really is about healing. It's about engagement of cultural values and local people's knowledge, so that what is created is not only that people are sustained by the ecosystems that we restore, but that people's participation sustains the ecosystem in return. It's this idea that all flourishing is mutual, that the flourishing of the land and the flourishing of the people are inseparable from one another. So that leads us even beyond biocultural restoration to think of a unique case of biocultural restoration that does promote this mutual flourishing. And this is what we're calling reciprocal restoration. And this is restoration practice, which is so deeply embedded in cultural values and goals, that restoring the land contributes to restoration of culture, cultural revitalization. And after a long and troubled history of cultural taking and cultural loss associated with colonialism and federal Indian policy, this is a time of tremendous resilience and resurgence in Indigenous communities, reclaiming their caregiving responsibilities for land and water, because cultural flourishing is completely dependent upon the flourishing of the land. And so restoring ecological integrity also restores cultural integrity. This is a bigger vision than even biocultural restoration. It is saying that in order to heal the land, or in healing the land, we're also healing ourselves. And in the examples that you'll hear in just a few minutes, you'll see, I think, evidence of that kind of reciprocity between land and people. And indeed, this is what we strive for in doing the work of biocultural and reciprocal restoration. Well, how? What does that look like? If we could imagine reference relationships and reference ecosystems within a reciprocal restoration framework, what does that mean? It means that we would be renewing material relationships with place. They might be subsistence relationships, foraging relationships, for example, or provisioning through ecosystem services. Reciprocal restoration means that when people again have caretaking access to the lands that they were excluded from, not only their own tribal lands, but ceded territories and unceded territories where they are no longer able to enact caretaking responsibilities. This means that restoration creates an opportunity for spiritual restoration, because once again, people can care for the lands that they were intended to. It also means revitalization of language and culture. Because if you can't take your grandkids fishing in the places where you used to, if you can't take your children basket material gathering, in my own research, if you can't take your family to go gather sweetgrass, will anybody remember how to make those sweetgrass baskets? Will anybody know the songs that go along with it? Will they know the language of how to spearfish? Reciprocal restoration means that as we restore the land to health so that subsistence practices can be revitalized, then language and culture and ceremony are revitalized as well. This means that to do reciprocal restoration, caretaking for knowledge, for traditional ecological knowledge, becomes one of the primary goals of restoration, is to care for that knowledge just as we would care for scientific knowledge, with, of course, an even greater urgency because of the fragility of some of that knowledge and knowledge holders. Reciprocal restoration leads to strengthened communities with greater resilience and adaptability to biodiversity changes, and certainly to climate change. It is an act of environmental justice, and in the framework of the language of the Haudenosaunee, my Haudenosaunee neighbors, we would call this peacemaking between land and people. This is, in fact, what we aspire to in reciprocal restoration. There are so many ways that we can restore a relationship to place. This is just a quick kind of brain dump of all of the practices that should be, I think, in the toolbox of the restoration ecologist. All of these things that we don't usually think about as the purview of engineers and hydrologists and fisheries biologists, right? But in order to do reciprocal restoration, we need to engage all these ways of knowing. Part of restoring relationship is restoring place names in original languages, restoration of ceremonies that are designed to care for those places and always have been part of the gratitude cycle for those places, reawakening stories and language. To restore relationship to place, it means that in the education of the restoration biologist, there needs to be education about treaty rights, because treaty rights, of course, go both ways, don't they? Around here, anyway, people often talk about them as native treaties, like there was only one signatory. No, those treaties belong to all of us, right? And to be a good to be engaged in restoration is to be engaged in upholding the potential for, and healing the land in such a way that treaty rights may be enacted. So deep and rich. We don't have a chance to talk about all these. I just wanted to make it a big, long list to stimulate your imagination. I'm almost out of time, so I want to begin to wind up with this notion again, the beautiful term from Gary Nabhan, who said that as we do restoration, what we also need to be engaged in, or have the opportunity to be engaged in, is restoration. Not only, again, healing the land, but telling ourselves and indeed living ourselves, living a different story of relationship to place, a different reference relationship. And that can be guided by these understanding of land as the teacher, as the pharmacy, as the library, as our home, as the place for which we have moral responsibility as well as physical responsibility. And one of the other pieces of that restoration is how we think about land and rivers. What is the story we tell about them? If you think back to that concept map of the Western notions of land as ecosystem services, capital, property, and natural resources, those are all objective, right? Those are all as if the land was only physical, as if the land was only soil, and as it was only stuff, right? And some of that stuff is commodities. But what if we go and look through the indigenous lens at what land means? Land is alive. Land is a person. Land is a being, and all of the beings are part of that beingness, if you will. And this notion of the animacy of land and rivers is captured in the new and emerging story, say the lawyers, but say indigenous people, it is in fact the ancient story of the personhood of all beings, including rivers, and now being recognized in law in new systems of jurisprudence of the legal rights of rivers. Both the Klamath River and the groundbreaking work of the Yurok, in the Wanganui River through the work of our Maori relatives, all part of the work of the rights of nature movement, which is restoration, telling ourselves that we can rewrite and participate in a different story, not a story where water is commodity, where watershed is just property, but where they are, and that they're not natural resources, but in fact they are our relatives. They are living beings, complicated, rich, diverse beings to whom we have reciprocal responsibility, just as we do to members of our own species. And so this expansion of thinking about restoration into restoration is an opportunity for reciprocal restoration for every one of us, to return to this notion that human people can be as relatives to the living world, that we can live in right relationship of respect and reciprocity with our more than human beings, through the personhood of all beings, including rivers. I want to say thank you so much for listening to these ideas and to expanding and sitting together with our imaginations of what it might mean for we human people to reciprocate the gifts of rivers. We began this talk with our gratitude for the land and for the waters. And well, let's close it in the same way, but with the hope that at the end of our words and our thoughts of gratitude for the land, that we might hear in return that we human people have lived in such a way that the rivers will be grateful for us. Mi'u, miigwech, thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Robin. Linlimt. What a great message for all of us today. There was quite a bit of requests on the line to learn more or to follow up with you. So here's my unashamed plug for your book, Writing Sweetgrass, which is out there. So again, I think if any attendees would like to delve in deeper, the resources are out there to get to fully understand what Robin was talking about today. Our next presentation is from Gabe Sheoships. Gabe is the executive director of the Friends of Tryon Creek, where he leads efforts focused on community building, environmental stewardship, and protection of the natural world. Gabe is Cayuse and Walla Walla from the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation. Gabe has spent his life along the travel corridors and pathways of the Columbia and the Willamette rivers, Willamette rivers, following traditional migratory routes of his ancestors. Gabe has dedicated his life's work to protecting Indigenous first foods, encouraging healthy ecosystems, and empowering people to act as stewards of the land and water. In the Portland metropolitan area, Gabe has roots and relationships with Black, Indigenous, immigrant, and refugee communities. Through these relationships, Gabe has built and advocated for change and continued support to meet community needs that have shifted and grown in his 20 years of work. Gabe serves as the board president for the Tributaries Network and on the board for the Center for Diversity and the Environment and Freshwaters Illustrated, each of which are nonprofit organizations. As an adjunct professor at Portland State University, Gabe instructs students within courses set in the Indigenous Nations Studies program, in the Environmental Sciences and Management, and the University Studies department. Gabe has a Master's of Science in Fisheries Biology from Oregon State University. Family, fatherhood, and friendship are what Gabe holds most important, which among others includes a college-aged son. So thank you, Gabe, for joining us today. Gabe will be sharing with us his presentation on the history of the Chiwana, the Columbia River, its indigenous worldviews of ecological systems. Gabe, I will pass it off to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carrie. And thank you everybody for joining us today. I want to give my thanks and utmost respect to Robin Kimmerer, who I met Dr. Kimmerer way back in 2013 at Oregon State University, and have followed her work for much longer. And I'll say, kind of in the picture of things, I can think of a person who would be harder to follow than such a well-spoken, brilliant person. But I appreciate learning from her, along with Charlie and Brittany, who we'll hear from later. And when I kind of gather, similarly to Robin, I like to acknowledge Indigenous lands. Today I'm calling in from what's now known as Portland, Oregon, where I live is just downstream a ways from Willamette Falls, which is a great, mostly intact cultural and ecological gathering area. And the city of Portland, Oregon is home to many tribes. And much of this has been politicized in our present day. But I'll just say what I was recently reminded by an elder, that land acknowledgements aren't just recognition of land, which is important, recognition of ancestors who have walked on the land, but also acknowledgement of how to act on the land, what kind of Indigenous stewardship ethic is involved. As Carrie mentioned, my name is Gabe Sheoships. My Indian name is Shiwatish Cow Cow. I am Cayusan Walla Walla from the Confederate Tribes of the Umatilla. I've traveled a lot of paths, and now I have the pleasure and the honor of leading a group, the Friends of Tryon Creek, who we work in partnership with Oregon State Parks to inspire and nurture relationships with a score of students, of youth, of elders, of natural area visitors throughout the year, and to inspire people to both restore and connect to what natural worlds we have remaining. So thank you. So just to start our talk, I'm thinking about the connection with the natural world and thinking about who's here and who's been here. In many of these talks and throughout the River Restoration Northwest and other scientific gatherings, the start of the talk or the history of a river basin often begins with the colonial history. For that and many other reasons, I think that's a grave mistake. Tribes of the Columbia River Basin, which I'll talk about today, have a long, valued, and history of working within the landscape, practicing reciprocity and responsibility to the lands and waters and all beings. In this kind of simple linear diagram, so I have kind of the Western calendar scale here represented here in the blue, and in the orange, the European occupation. And really what this is to say is this is also an acknowledgement that today our contemporary society is having trouble working within or managing our ecosystem now. And this is also based off the Western calendar scale, because we know through growing up, other than through my traditional teachings, that we were here much longer than we were being represented as tribal people in history books. We were in school. I'm sure many of us learned alongside the Bering Strait theory and the idea that tribal people traversed over an ice bridge that connected Siberia to present-day Alaska. And flash forward 20 years or so, and we've found that theory has been debunked. Humans have lived, thrived, and worked in Turtle Island far longer than the Bering Strait was actually navigable. So we've been here much longer, and that accurately connects with our oral histories and our traditional knowledge that talk about the Missoula floods and displacements and our vast history here. So kind of based on that representation, I put together this circular graph, which represents our Indigenous presence in blue and European occupation in white. And really to say that we as Indigenous people have spent a lot of time, a lot of generations building that knowledge and building into that balance with the natural world. And a lot of that knowledge isn't being acknowledged today, or it's been erased in our history books and ignored in our public school systems. My hopes and thoughts behind this talk and many others are that we can think about this as we practice ecological restoration, and we can utilize this knowledge to build the foundation to a better world. So all of my thoughts and values represented today in this talk were built and understood pre-colonization. So what we as the tribe say, since time immemorial, so basically forever. So thinking about in river restoration years, I know we're thinking 5, 10, 20. Indigenous timelines, we look much beyond that. We're looking 5 generations, 10 generations. We're looking 50, 100 years. Here in the Columbia Basin, Colonization is relatively new compared with different parts of the world, roughly 170 to 200 years. In human years, that's also pretty short. Myself, I grew up pretty close with my grandmother, who lived to be 90, and she in turn lived to be with her grandmother, and who also lived to be about 90. So I think in terms of oral histories and sharing knowledge, we have a purview and a scope of what colonization was and the effects on the landscape, and of course the effects on the people. So often when I do these talks, people will say, well, Gabe, Europeans brought religion or a way of belief or a belief system to the Americas. And I have to remind them that we have a belief system that's intact and that has been pushed aside, but has really been grounding and has brought us through these times. And this belief system is similar across Turtle Island, but due to tribal diversity and diversity of language, takes on different names and different understandings. But there's an inherent balance or reciprocity to this. Here in the Columbia River Basin, we call this Tamanwit. And this is a natural law, a law that guides tribal people through balance and reciprocity. This is our everything, our way of looking out at the ecosystem and maintaining, and also that inherent stewardship ethic to care for these things. So that responsibility to all of these living things, to our first foods, to water, of course, water is life, and to our lands and our elders, of course, and then our next generations, our future generations. So in contemporary times, I pulled a colleague of mine who has developed what's known as the Relational Worldview. This is Dr. Terry Cross of the National Nch'i Welfare Association. And this relational worldview is basically sums up our natural laws into contemporary form. And so, really just looking at our world through a contemporary, a circular mindset. So thinking about things, and this quote is direct, it's that change is a constant, inevitable, cyclical, and dynamic part of the human experience that occurs in natural, predictable patterns and can be facilitated to promote desired and measurable outcomes. So change is all around us. The relational worldview really hones in the idea of maintaining balance. So maintaining balance between different aspects of your life, your physical being, your mental, your emotions, your esteem, but also your context. So your physical placements, your school, education, work, how you move about in modern society, and your spirituality, which many grasp as in relation to Western religion. But in tribal belief systems, it's really more encompassing than that. It's everything around us. It's our spiritual connection to water, our first foods, our ancestors, and our descendants. And so really, the relational worldview says, to live in harmony, we must maintain a balance between all of these things around us. And that's what we as Indigenous people strive to do today. So this in the Columbia River Basin is part of the Tamanwit. So this is understanding of a natural law, and not in the aspect of a modern day contemporary law. It's not criminal, civil, or business related. It's the idea that if you live in a good way and you embody this stewardship ethic, good things will happen. And if you maintain and provide that inherent responsibility to the landscape, you are then fulfilling the Tamanwit, or the natural law. So through these teachings and through traditional knowledge, a contemporary reflection of Indigenous lifeways in relation to first foods is what's known as a seasonal round. So this here that you can see is a Plateau seasonal round. So this is kind of a contemporary representation of a decolonized map / ecological calendar. This is knowledge that's inherent to survival, is both familial and tribal based. It basically kind of demonstrates what first foods were provided when and where throughout each time of the year. So obviously in spring, winter, summer months, there was different relationships at play and different migratory pathways for Indigenous people and different ways of securing first foods to provide for people. This is a place-based map that varies across geographies, but is again inherently the same. This is circular knowledge that's been passed on through generations, and it's been essential to both guiding tribal people individually, but also is now being brought into natural resource planning, which, if you know of the Umatilla River Vision, has adopted this into ecological restoration goals. So that's a big piece of where we're going. And that directly correlates with our first foods and their serving order, and how we balance everything across water. Without water, we would have nothing. We are water. And our first foods are fish and our game, our roots, our plants, and our berries. So these are all essential and integral to our lifeways. Whether we are traversing to mountainsides in the summer to collect and gather berries, or hunting in the wintertime, or heading down to the lowlands in the spring to fish for Chinook or lamprey, we are maintaining our lifeways in this contemporary time. These are values that steer our tamanwit, or our natural law, and are to be provided for. And these are really values that should steer restoration goals. These are also, many of these are keystone species. Many of these are indicators of our relationship with the environmental world. So shifting a little bit. So when I think a big piece of my time here today is thinking about restoration. What are we restoring to? But also thinking about decolonization. What are we decolonizing from? So in many ways, restoration is decolonization. But in many ways, it's not. Wetland credits and other examples come to mind. But the degradement of our natural systems, our natural world, has certainly been an effect of our natural systems and our indigenous lifeways and our indigenous people. This one slide represents, the doctrine of discovery, manifest destiny, the papal bulls, assimilation, boarding schools, degradation of land, farming, the Dust Bowl, you name it. This one slide could be a separate talk, but I'm going to leave it at that for time constraints. But when we're thinking about decolonization, this is what we're decolonizing from. All of the effects of these acts that have a strong role with tribes today. If you look at tribal people and you look at indicators of social and physical health, we are at the bottom of every category, at the highest percentiles of all major health indicators, and no more of that is that a valuable lesson is thinking today in contemporary times about COVID-19, the pandemic, and both the death rates and who's suffering the most from all of these social ills that are predated from colonization. So shifting, so walking us through a very brief history of the Columbia River in Chiwana, and our dam system, which brought us to the current state we are in with our relationship to fish and other first foods that depend on the river system, which is basically everything. So one of our elders of the time, from my tribe, Sam Cash, he's in regards to the further dam construction of the Columbia River. This is the Dalles Dam and other dams that had been erected post 1938 in the Bonneville Dam. And this quote gives you an idea of the mindset of the time. while tribes are struggling, he said, we won't accept, we reject any offer, regardless of whether you bring your golden hayracks or whatever you bring in. We don't want the money. We really want our rights. This was, again, 60 years ago. Tribes hadn't established the political or legal power that we have now. Times were much harder. Our ancestors channeled this inner resilience, that brings us forward to today. So kind of walking in contrast to a relational, circular, holistic worldview. Many of us are familiar with what's known as Western American thought. This is the backbone for Western science. This is a system that I'm sure many folks on this call have done quite well in. This is commerce, capitalism, development, etc. This is, in a nutshell, again, borrowing from Terry Cross, cause and effect, equal, directly finding a cause and tying in an effect, and then starting over. So dialing things down to the smallest practical piece, studying, dissecting, and then moving along. So basically, the linear worldview, the linear relationship, developing, building, commerce, are all part of that kind of Western thought, American worldview. Due to time constraints, I won't get too far into it, but I think you get the picture. This is the LA River. Like many rivers, the thought was 60, 70 years ago, let's control river complexity. Let's try to prevent flooding, and let's dam it and irrigate it and use it as a sewer in some places. So this is not kind of recognizing the long-standing relationship with rivers and with what they can provide. And this is a system that has been interrupted and has been more and more in a short time being, found both the ecological and cultural fallacies within. I think we're seeing what we're seeing the ramifications now for what we've done to try to control the natural world, whether it's wildfires on the West Coast, mistreating our river systems, and generally negatively reflecting the balance within our ecosystem. So through that linear worldview, that American thought, more close to home here in the Pacific Northwest, colonization brought an influx of people that had much different ideas and beliefs for how to utilize the land. Here in Portland, Oregon, and most of Oregon and Washington, logging and timber harvesting is a huge, both an ecological impact, but an economic driver. Most of the old Oregon money that exists today stems in some way from timber, from logging. And as we know, that's had a deep, devastating effect on our relationship with fire. And fire was prevalent historically in Oregon and Washington, for since time immemorial. Fire had an important relationship with the landscape. Being suppressed for the last 100 years has brought us to the place we're in now. More into through my history as a fish biologist, logging is dredging, logging and log drives and log jams and driving logs down from mountains where they were harvested, brought negative ecological effects of dredging the bottom of rivers, interrupting important spawning gravel, and having a negative effect on the relationship with fire. Again, railroads. So both historically and in contemporary times, railroads have, the railroad construction has interrupted rivers, streams, we're literally driven through mountains. Much of our railroad system in Oregon is connected along traditional indigenous travel corridors, low points, often next to the rivers and streams. And the construction of these railroads has limited our river systems drastically. I mean, obviously causing channelization, lessening stream complexity, and then what's being brought in from these railroads. Even today we have coal trains and we have fracking waste that is brought into our state from other places. So this has been a 100-year problem. And not to mention who built the railroads. It was here in Oregon, it was predominantly immigrant Chinese laborers who were brought in to do one thing, and were horribly mistreated alongside that. Murdered, killed, massacred, and those who survived weren't allowed to marry, basically had to hide out and traverse to the urban populations for survival. So, and then in the lower right-hand corner there, I think we all know the largest largest piece of intact ecological devastation is large-scale hydroelectric dams. Both have limited aquatic species, have transformed our river systems into reservoir systems, and have impacted tribal lifeways in multiple ways. A direct result of dams is the advent of the fish hatchery. And many are familiar with hatchery science, hatchery practices in the Pacific Northwest. We're basically trying to mimic the natural world and recreate a system using a very linear agricultural model of growing the biggest, strongest fish for a limited duration, setting them free, and then hoping that they'll return, with the idea that if we grow more larger fish and release them, they'll come back. But everybody from tribal fishermen to fish hatchery managers to natural resource decision makers know that this practice has been failing. And we have more resources than ever put into this system, and I think everything around us indicates that we're failing. Including the number of spring Chinook returns, which are and have been devastatingly low. So the advent of dams. So part of the idea of constructing dams, of controlling rivers, was because of large, devastating 100-year floods, like took place in Vanport in the Portland area. So this was both an ecological disaster, but a social justice disaster, as the most diverse 40% of Vanport's population was African American, and this was a little city built alongside a floodplain. So those with a tiny bit of ecological knowledge would know that at some point this area is going to flood, and it's going to flood badly. And this, because of this flood, I mean, I think the messaging of the time was that we need to control the flooding, we need to construct more dams and control the river more. But what's lesser known is that plans for larger and more dams had already been set into place years before. This is even after the construction of the Bonneville Dam. And that was all, so Vanport was used as propaganda to build more dams, because this idea had been set into place years prior. And it was really built off of commerce. So the idea of creating a shipping port that would access Portland, Vancouver, all the way into Idaho, and to create a commerce and shipping channels to further develop the West. And Hillman Ludman, who around that time was the chairman of the Port Development Committee of the city of Portland, and this is a direct quote, said, New Orleans has stolen the traffic from the Southeast. New Orleans has dwarfed those ports because of draining the inland traffic down through the Mississippi. And likewise, New York had dwarfed Philadelphia, Boston, and Baltimore because she has drained the low-cost traffic from that great hinterland down through New York and Portland. And Portland and Vancouver can do the same thing. So basically, the arms race of creating ports to export commerce, throughout the world. And of course, as we know, this happened. And this created scores of intergenerational wealth. This created a great economy within the region. This created, agricultural commodities being sold and traded throughout the world. And so this benefited one subset of people, primarily European white people. And who this didn't benefit was tribes. And tribes that we actually lost our greatest in the area, meeting place, fishing sites, gathering locale from tribes all the way east to the Great Plains, up and down throughout the Pacific Northwest. From south, this was a grand gathering place that was lost with the construction of the Dallas Dam in 1957, and for the reason of commerce to benefit a small group. And so Arnie Samula, the master fish warden for the Oregon Fish Commission at the time, said, with all this, it certainly looks like we have a very dark picture in our fisheries resource if the ultimate plan of the development of the Columbia River is carried out. And if the full program goes into effect, the salmon runs to the upper Columbia and middle Columbia River, I think, will be seriously and very seriously damaged. So Arne was basically saying what the tribe said at the time, and I think what we all know happened today. It's very obvious that these are our poor state of fisheries and in direct correlation are the further continuation of colonization for tribal people is directly related to these acts. And Arnie's prediction basically came true. So what does that mean today? So I would second Robin's call to action that restoration needs to be embodied with a cultural lens. Tribes need to be leaders. Traditional ecological knowledge needs to be gathered and utilized in these processes, as restoration cannot exist in a silo. And it's not just ecological, physical restoration that's happening. It's also furthering connections for Indigenous peoples, furthering connections to first foods and traditional migratory corridors. There's so much more into it than what it is. And Tom Carrier from the Northwest Power and Conservation Council, just a couple of years ago, wrote a couple of letters to the Oregonian. And he'd served on the Northwest Power and Conservation Council for the last 20 years. And he's saying what tribal fishermen have been saying for the same amount of time, but he has a much grander pedestal. And this is just an excerpt, but he said that the problem is that Bonneville's budget priorities reflect political compromises rather than fish priorities. Most of Bonneville's money is spent on overhead planning, studies, contracting, coordination, research, monitoring, and evaluation. Precious few dollars flow into on-the-ground projects. So again, we are attempting to quote unquote manage our natural resources using this very linear system. We need to ground in Indigenous knowledge, and through that more of a relational worldview and a relational value of our natural resources, thinking in much larger, broader terms. So thinking 7 generations, thinking 100 years, which is short in river years, but thinking about these things in a much larger, broader way, and how we can connect to all of this, because restoration can't really be done in a silo. So lastly, what's often missed in this conversation is, in this short amount of time, people gained a lot of, and again, generated, life-changing and intergenerational wealth. Farmers, ranchers, loggers, and this is being wielded today, for everything from political gain to, further colonization of Indigenous peoples. An easy example of that is during the construction of the Columbia River dams, specifically the Dalles Dam, tribal villages were flooded, impacted, destroyed. Since this happened 50, 60, 70 years ago, there was a promise from the Army Corps of Engineers that these villages would be rebuilt. In 2021, this still hasn't happened. Whereas, towns like North Bonneville, white towns were heavily invested in and rebuilt, and they look pristine today. Six or seven towns were rebuilt in that span and are fully functional and intact. Whereas tribes, again, are suffering, and promises from the powers that be haven't been fulfilled. So I think often when we think of who's in these positions of power, how has that wealth and power been generated? In these instances, we can very much dial that in and track that. So with that said, I want to thank everybody for listening. Thank you for your time. If you have any questions, save them for later. Katsiyayo.
Lim, thank you so much, Gabe. I found reflecting on during your talk, what a great reminder, even introduction, it has been about the amount of the knowledge that's contained within the Indigenous people and the communities, and that it's not lost. It's marginalized and disregarded, but it's not lost. And a lot of the weaknesses in Western science in terms of a linear logic line is that we gather, we interpret, but we don't realize we're interpreting data and information through our worldview. I think it's a great reminder that we can't separate a knowledge from its people. We can't separate Indigenous knowledge from the Indigenous nations where they currently exist. We mess up, we miss the interpretation if we don't do it if it's not done within an Indigenous worldview. So I think that's a really great, a great core message for so many of us. And the other topic that keeps mulling around in my head with your and Robin's talks is so much of this concept of a wealth of a few versus the wealth for many. So both of you did allude to how ecosystems provide these gifts for all of us. And just from my own experiences, so there's tribes in the southern Okanagan, and the only sections of the Okanagan River that are left natural with floodplains or any natural sections exist on the band's lands. That's the only place. And there's no compensation for the fact that they have saved these areas. And yet, when we try to turn that into what is an economic valuation, it's in the millions of dollars that these properties have contributed to the wealth, carbon sequestering, recreational fishing opportunities upstream and downstream, water quality and air quality. It's in the millions every year that these areas have provided to the broader community. And it is such a gift that I think we often overlook. So I really appreciated your talk today, and Robin. I think those are some fabulous fundamentals for I think so many of us to kind of get our heads wrapped around. We are going to take a 5-minute break. So we'll be returning at 2:42, pretty promptly in 5 minutes. I would just like to remind people that we have 2 more presentations, Charlie and Brittany, after the break. The question and answer session that we're receiving a lot of questions for. Great, lots of people have lots of feedback, will occur roughly at around 3:40. And we look forward to seeing you guys in 5 minutes. So this is your refresh break, and we will see you soon. Thank you. Sorry there, I'm unmuting myself. Welcome back, everyone, to the continuation of talks on biocultural restoration with the River Restoration Northwest. As another gentle reminder to all participants, if you have questions for our speakers today, please log them into the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We have gotten quite a few so far, so we've got a bit to choose from. I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Nch'i, also known as Charlie Reed. Charlie is Karuk, Hoopa, and Yurok, person of the Klamath Trinity watershed in Northern California. He is a Hoopa Valley tribal member that grew up in a Karuk household, primarily learning the language, practices, and ceremonies of the Karuk people. Along with the rich lineage he inherited comes a responsibility for his people, cultures, and environment. One of his inherent responsibilities involves advocating for the future of his more than human relative, the spring Chinook salmon. And this is why he has chosen to attend Humboldt State University in pursuit of a master's degree in environment and community social science program. His degree will create a narrative that reaffirms Indigenous people's experiences, values, and perspectives, and that his ancestors have learned for generations. So look out for that thesis as it comes out in the public world. Charlie will be talking about and advocating for the protection of spring Chinook salmon in the Klamath Trinity watershed from an Indigenous knowledge perspective. I'm going to pass the virtual mic off to Charlie there. Thank you.
Thank you all for joining me today. I'm going to quickly share my screen before we get started. Okay. And just like Gabe and Dr. Wall Kimmerer did so eloquently, I'd like to also recognize the land that I'm currently occupying here in Humboldt County in McKinleyville, California, occupied Wiyot territory. And I really liked what Gabe had said as far as like it's not just a recognition, which is important. It is also an opportunity to raise awareness and kind of talk about what kind of call to action that we could all hold ourselves accountable for. For me, I currently work at Two Feathers Native American Family Services, where I do serve local community Native families who I call at risk or at promise, which is often called at risk, and incorporating cultural knowledge into healing practices there. So that's how I am doing my due diligence and fulfilling my responsibility to this land and community that I reside on. So with that, I want to encourage everyone to kind of reach out to the local communities, Native communities that we currently, who are our neighbors and that we're guests to. So with that, I'll go ahead and transition to my thesis project today. And like Kari had mentioned, I am an ENC grad student at Humboldt State, where my thesis is on advocating for the protection of spring Chinook salmon in the Klamath Trinity watershed from an Indigenous knowledge perspective. So I think it fits in perfectly with what we're talking about, what we're all here for today, and practicing biocultural restoration. Really excited, super hyped to be following such a great few speakers. This is exactly the space that I like to be in. So who am I? I'm a Hoopa Yurok person, which right here on this map is a good kind of depiction on how closely knit of communities we are. That just happens to be in the Klamath Trinity watershed. And so with that comes a huge responsibility of mine to kind of, for one, be a responsible ancestor and also passing on cultural knowledge to future generations. And today I think the most important thing is protecting our more than human relatives, which is why I have used Western academics as a platform, as a medium to effectively create change and protect the future of our people, our land, and our culture. And so, yeah, that goes into my inherent responsibility. I'm a Pikiawish world renewal priest, also known as Fatnuanan, as busybody is what it directly translate. And what I am responsible for is fixing the world and putting the world back into balance. And I think traditionally that would look a little differently than how I'm kind of upholding that by attending a Western academic space, but I think that in this modern time, so much has been stripped from us and taken from us intentionally. It's important that we use these spaces in Western science, like we're all speaking to kind of fill those gaps and help us get to the ultimate goal of restoring balance in this natural world, as well as social world, and especially cultural world, because we've been greatly impacted. And so yeah, Kuduk dip net fisherman, and I think it's important for you all to know these different hats that I wear, because in my research, you'll see a lot of different perspectives that kind of speak to that. And, I'm a first time father to baby Ishaha. One of the greatest moments in my life is becoming a father and also a husband. So I think that also speaks to who I am and where I'm at right now in my personal life. But I'm just being very transparent and how important this work is to me. Like, it's super interconnected with my personal life, my professional life, and my academic career. So I love this type of work. I love the interconnectedness that this panel and this this project that we're all part of does. And so here's a pretty special picture for me, because this is my dad right here dip netting at our traditional fishery, Ishipishi Falls in the Klamath River. And that's me right there as a little guy kind of watching him on. And that's kind of who I always give credit to when I'm speaking in these spaces, because without him, I wouldn't be as confident and as knowledgeable of a person that I am today, as well as being, an academic student like I am today as well. So that's a little bit about who I am. And so I just also want to let you guys know kind of how I plan on moving forward with this presentation. The previous presentations were really artful and creative, and a lot of pictures that tells a lot of stories with that. So I really want to let you guys know this is definitely a lot more academic, but it's also like super fun for me and super knowledgeable. So I hope you guys enjoy. And I'll be talking about like the environmental issues, the policy and cultural issues with the lack of protection for the spring chinook salmon in the Klamath Trinity watershed, and how I, from my personal experiences and from my recent research, I call it a modern form of genocide, and how if we don't protect or have opportunity to restore habitat and also the population of spring chinook salmon, that it'll be an ongoing form of cultural genocide. And then, so that's when after I talk about those issues, that kind of the issues of the lack of protection, I'll transition to like my personal project and how I plan about approaching it and the findings that I have at this point. So I hope you all enjoy, and here we go. So obviously we know that salmon are really keystone species to people, to the environment, to the ecosystems. And with the dams so historically I've heard a lot of stories from my ancestors, from my relatives, who would say like you could literally walk on the backs of the salmon at certain points of the year. And I think that's because of the broodstock of spring chinook salmon. And I can't honestly say that I've had that same experience growing up. Of course, there's moments where I couldn't imagine how many fish that we're catching at our traditional fishery. There's times where we catch 100 in a day. I get pulled out of school, and it'd be the best day ever to get pulled out of school to go fishing, help carry fish out, club, like just practice my responsibility. And also just being in, a social setting where you see people who look like you, people who have the same interests in you. And it's just like a perfect kind of social setting for a young adolescent, young boy too. So I think that's something that it could be taken from us if if our salmon returns kind of dwindle. And so 90% of the spawning habitat is inaccessible due to the dams. And there's 5 really detrimental dams that have been on the Klamath River, which I hope to be coming down in 2024. So that's definitely good news, but I think there's still a lot of work to be done. And that obviously impacts water flows and water quality, which in turn impacts the health of our fish, river, and species. And so I think that's something that we must take seriously. And as much as we did celebrate, the news of removing the dams, I think we're all back to the drawing board as far as how we plan to restore habitat, restore different species that are kind of on the brink And I highly emphasize how important it is that Native and Indigenous peoples lead that effort, because now's the time to kind of redistribute that power that back to the Native peoples, because our social and cultural health depend on it. And so the policies around the protection of spring chinook salmon comes from, Endangered Species Act, which is designed to protect species that are on the decline due to, different habitat destruction and inaccessibility. However, in this instance, the spring chinook salmon, actually, it's been an ongoing fight that a lot of local communities and Kaduk tribe have been going against, as far as like it's almost like it's a new form. It's not a new form, but it's a form of structural racism, and how policies and different acts that have been implemented kind of marginalize spring chinook salmon. There's been efforts that have been declined, rejected, because of there's a fear of it kind of opening a floodgate to advocate or to protect a lot of different species who kind of go back and forth on the genetic difference, or quote unquote too similar to grant protection. And so that really becomes harmful, because local natives and local stewards of the land know, like, this is, a small percentage, small portion of historical numbers, but they just, for some reason, failed to meet the criteria that's in this box here to my right, to be protected, and to have funding efforts to restore that population. So it's teeter-tottering with, that obviously the fish who are going to be on the brink of extinction, but also the social health, which I'll talk about here in my next slide. Like, we all know that Native peoples have a symbiotic relationship with the natural world. And for Kaduk people and a lot of river communities like the Hupa and Yurok have a really closely knit relationship with salmon. Like, our lives and sustainability depends on salmon. And there are stories that tell us that once, there isn't fish in the river, then we cease to exist as people, and honestly fail to uphold our privilege to be stewards and people of the land. So it's really important. It's extremely vital to our existence and our responsibility. This is a picture of my dad and a relative of ours, Kaduk person here, made National Geographic. So there's definitely the platform. I think now we just need to come together and just do what's right, and kind of restore the ecosystems, but also allow tribal people, Native people, to be ahead of those decisions. So this is a lot of this information that I've come to be a caretaker of is something I just knew, like just being surrounded by a lot of my local community members. And it wasn't until 2012 when Dr. Kari Norgard started like using academics and kind of research to quantify what we already know is, like, if the decrease of spring chinook salmon, that means our health conditions plummet. And this graph shows that almost too harshly, where you see the decline of spring chinook on the blue line, and you see the rate of diabetes and health implications skyrocket. And that's definitely not a coincidence. That's a pretty close correlation. And so that's one of the many reasons why this is an issue. The next is, like I was mentioning, some of my earliest and enjoyable moments have come from this. I remember being carried down there by my dad, me and my brother on one arm on each side, and just thinking, wow, this guy's incredible for being able to leap from rock to rock with both of his sons in the arm, and then go and dip around like it's nothing. So like just being in that, like that's what inspired me. Like, I'm gonna be him one day. And and just following through with that has been everything, and my life has turned around significantly since I came back into good relationship with my family, with my community, and the natural world. And so if we're out managing and being stewards of the land, like, our social health benefits, therapy is going fishing, therapy can be burning, therapy could be managing our basketry materials. Like, it's all interweave woven. So that's kind of what I'm trying to bring out in my work, is that you can't talk about fisheries management without talking about social implications that could resolve. And last but not least, the issues of settler colonial view of land dispossession, the fact that the Kaduk tribe doesn't have a reservation or have access to land management stewardship, and are like, the only fishery that we have doesn't allow us to manage for it. Like, it's honestly like an inherited right fishery space where we kind of just have a good relationship, to where that's not like, I think we could honestly get in trouble for exercising our responsibility there. And luckily and fortunately that we live in a time where we're able to kind of navigate that without having to pay fines and get in trouble, because I mean, you almost have to be a sneaky criminal, smooth criminal, to be able to practice our religion. This is forms of our religion that we're talking about. And something that I'm thinking of just off the top of my head, the spiritual kind of component of the health of the river, health of the salmon, like our ceremonies are triggered by the arrival of spring Chinook salmon. So if spring Chinook salmon don't return, then how are we supposed to know that it's time to start our world renewal ceremonies? So that's evidence as far as like how it's a form of cultural genocide. And so how this pertains to my research project, that mostly was information that I have come to know just through my personal life. And then there's also some citations that I'd used that come from some secondary source analysis, archival data, Kaduk language analysis. And I'm also in the middle of having a 5-episode podcast that stems off of community-based participatory action research, where I'll interview familial, like some members of my family, my dad, my brothers, and kind of get the importance, the history of spring Chinook salmon, get that data. And then I plan on kind of interviewing some local cultural practitioners as well, to see to see what they have to offer and what they know that could support the advocacy and the genetic difference of spring and fall Chinook salmon. And then, I know how important it is to bridge Western science with traditional ecological knowledge. I think it's important that we include, different geneticists like Mike Miller and water lawyers and a lot of different people who have a lot to offer, to make sure that we are working together and coming together to, protect the natural world and our more than human relatives. And I know that, coming from my experiences, I know that our language holds a lot of knowledge and information, in which I think that could help us really get a greater understanding of how to restore, how to protect, and how to prove that spring Chinook salmon have a different responsibility, have a different need, that kind of bridges with Western science, genetics, kind of theories and findings. And I think that'll put together a narrative that will grant change from a policy level. And then I think that'll be a perfect way to kind of segue into the next generation, and how important spring Chinook salmon is to them, and how important it is to make sure that we are protecting our relatives and protecting our responsibilities and social health. So I think I'm really excited to see and have this project surface, because I think a lot of this could be applicable, at least a seed, for a lot of different communities who are looking to have partnership and healthy relationships with local tribal communities. And I'm just happy to be in a position to be a pretty strong and unique bridge between Western science and traditional science, Indigenous science. So some of the questions is like the cultural significance of the salmon. How can Indigenous knowledge support the debate? What role does the Kaduk tribe have in watershed management decisions? So again, kind of getting back to allowing Native Indigenous peoples to lead these restoration efforts, especially in wake of the dam removal process set to take in 2024. And how can, the information that we learn from these interviews inform our restoration efforts? So those are some of the questions that I plan on kind of highlighting and So yeah, be on the lookout for that in the next year. So what we do know is Indigenous knowledge. Our language shows that the word cheapish is a smolt/snook who migrates in the spring, and ama is a word used before ceremonies begin, and it's kind of like a general word to explain that fish. And Nch'i is winter salmon, because Nch'i means winter, At means salmon. So again, language is telling us right there that there's a difference between the two, the variations as time runs. I mentioned before ceremonial indicator species, and it indicates the start of world renewal. So that's really important for the future and sustainability and effectiveness of our world renewal ceremonies. If we don't have that timing right, then it's to believe that like we kind of missed our window of opportunity to put the world back in balance. And I think this coincides pretty significantly with the genetic findings. The GREB1L locus region identifies with the migration gene, and that's work that Prince and others out of UC Davis kind of found, and I think that's groundbreaking. And so and then what Dr. Kari Norgard and my dad, Ron Reed, kind of highlighted in various articles from 2005, 12, and 16, and even more recently in their book, Salmon Acorns Feed Our People, access to traditional diet is equivalent to healthy communities. So that's what we do know, and I think that has a strong foundation to make sure that, one, we get the protection that we need for spring chinook salmon, and two, to allow Native folks to be at the table for discussions that really allow us to have a well-balanced future with, our friends in the Western science, well, non-natives, with the natives right there, with the natural world right there too. So I think that's the perfect recipe to make sure that we do our due diligence as stewards of the land. I think that's kind of what this slide here shows, is just how this could be detrimental to the self-efficacy for Native folks to be in these stewardship positions. Just knowing how important it is for us to have a sense of belonging in our culture, in our place, and in our communities, and having our place-based religion being the foundation to restore, protect, and govern our watershed management decisions. Speaking to what Gabe and Dr. Walt Kimmerer was speaking to, as far as our culture, our religion, can really lead us to a different paradigm as far as how we view the natural world. And that's all I have for you all today. So like I said, be on the lookout for my thesis project coming out of Humboldt State here in the next semester or two. And I hope you guys enjoyed. And like we also mentioned earlier, at 3:40 we'll be fielding some questions. Actually, this last slide is pretty sentimental to me. The picture on the left is here, my wife and my baby, 8-month-old, the other day. And this is a picture of myself in the middle with my dad kind of looking on, giving me advice on how to traditionally dip net fish here. And so I think that kind of speaks to the first slide on when I was watching him. Now I'm kind of learning and he's teaching me along the side. And I had to put a picture of my daughter in here, baby Nch'i. So thank you all for listening in, and hear from you here at 3:40.
Oh, Lim, thank you, Charlie. Oh. There is, Charlie, before you go, there's quite a few people that have been commenting in the question in the chat line that they would like to follow your podcast. Do you have directions for them to be able to do that?
I don't at this moment, but let me reshare my screen so that they could have my
email. We can also maybe try and find it and put it in the chat line before the end of the sessions today.
Okay, so yeah, just a couple more moments of maybe getting my information down and just giving me email. I'll have like a nice contact list to make sure that the folks who are interested will have access, and still trying to work out those logistics as far as where I'm going to broadcast that, but I appreciate the interest, and we'll put information in the chat as well. Thank you.
Yeah, it's great. And thank you again so much for your for your talk today on the spring Chinook and the value of returning those species. I think there was a number of comments also in the line about climate change and how Indigenous knowledge is going to cope with climate change. And again, just using my own experiences sitting with elders and elder knowledge. There's so much talk, like within the last several 10,000 years, how the climate in even this valley has changed so much. We just happen to have been sitting into a really sweet spot with not actually a lot of variability, really. And that the elders remember or have stories going back to 50 and 100-year droughts that existed throughout the Columbia and the Klamath and the Okanagan, and that it was through the worldview and through reciprocity with nature that people coped with it and figured it out. I don't know if you have anything else to add to that concept, but I think it's it has a huge value, because I think the one big concern we have moving forward is how we're going to deal with climate change.
Yes, exactly. I think it does have great, like, indigenous knowledge and, you know, thousands of years of practice. I think will definitely grant very credible and wise kind of practices, and we can definitely have those conversations with, you know, Western scientists and restorationists as well, and make sure that we do our due diligence navigating these choppy times.
Yeah, thank you. And I think just in general, we need to kind of like blow the lid off the idea that that people just moved away when it got bad in one place. You can't do that. Everybody would have to move somewhere else in some of the indigenous landscape. People stayed and they figured it out. So again, thank you so much for your talk today. That was really, really wonderful. I'm going to migrate now to our final speaker this afternoon, which is Brittany Arona. Brittany is an enrolled member of the Hoopa Valley tribe. She is currently a PhD candidate at UC Davis in Native American Studies with a designated emphasis in human rights. Brittany is interested in repatriation, federal Indian law, cultural resource management, Indigenous environmental justice, environmental history as it relates to California Indian tribes. You have a lot set out for you there. Her dissertation research focuses on Hoopa, Yurok, and Kuruk perspectives of visual sovereignty, memory, human and water rights on the Klamath River Basin. She is currently a board advisor for Save California Salmon, a grassroots organization dedicated to protecting rivers through the restoration of flows and salmon habitat, removing dams, and improving water quality throughout Northern California. Also, huge task. Brittany was a 2019 Switzer Environmental Fellow and the inaugural 2020 Incognito's Lupiner Scholar. Brittany today will be presenting This is Our Home, This is Our Land, Visualizing Decolonization on the Klamath River Basin. I'm so excited to have you today. I'm going to pass it on to Brittany.
Thank you, and thank you for everybody for staying and, you know, listening to all these really great talks. I've been learning so much and really enjoying listening to everybody. But so hey, I'm Brittany Arona. I'm a member of the Hoopa Valley tribe up in northwestern California, and actually, Charlie and I just figured out that we're cousins. Our grandparents were our first cousins, so it's always funny to have and nice to have connections with other Klamath River people. And so today my talk really focuses on my dissertation research. This is stuff that I could talk about for hours and hours, and have been thinking about and studying for quite a long time. And I'm really glad that Charlie went ahead of me and really kind of set the scene on the things that are happening on the Klamath River towards ecological restoration and all the great work that he and his family have been doing over generations, and all the work that our tribes have been doing over generations as well. And I also want to acknowledge where I'm at right now, where I situate myself. I'm on the traditional homelands of the lands of the Nisenan and Miwok peoples of the Sacramento Valley in Sacramento, California. So tribes on the Klamath, the lower Klamath River Basin. So my dissertation really looks at the ways in which tribes have used visual sovereignty, so art, advocacy, activism, to combat genocidal water infrastructure projects on the Klamath, really focusing on the dam removal efforts on the Klamath River of Copco 1, Copco 2, J.C. Boyle, and Iron Gate dams on the upper Klamath Basin. But we have been living on the Klamath River since time immemorial. My dissertation looks at tribes of the lower Klamath, the Hoopa, Yurok, and Karuk peoples, of which I'm descended from. And so I think a really important point to note with tribes on the Klamath River is that, and Charlie did a really great job of setting this up, but we're still very connected to our homelands. What happens to the Klamath River, what happens to the river tributaries happens to us. We have a very strong relationship with our more than human kin, the salmon, the lamprey that reside in the river. And so I think it's really important too that I situate that our traditions and our religious, our ceremonies carry on into the present. So Charlie mentioned that we are world renewal people. We do the world renewal dances that are situated on the rivers. We actually do a dance that is literally on the river, the boat dance going up and down to different village sites. And these dances occur depending on the tribe that you're in, or the dances that you follow, yearly or bi-yearly. I'm Hoopa, and I actually go to the Karuk dances because my I have family that are Karuk tribal members as well. And so it's really a community-based place. Like, we know each other, we interact with each other. And so I always think it's kind of interesting to put the Edward Curtis photograph, which is the older one on the left-hand side, and it's called a Smoky Day on the Sugar Bowl. Edward Curtis is a very, very famous ethnographer, photographer who went around and took pictures of American Indians during the turn of the century, and really was subscribing to this idea that Native people were vanishing and going away. But I think given the talks that we have today, we know that's not true. So this is an overview of what the Klamath River basin looks like. The basin is often, and the river system is often described as a river system turned upside down. That's because the headwaters start up in Oregon and then move down to the western area, and end at the mouth of the Klamath River, which is a traditional territory of the Yurok people, Requa. And as you can see, there are many different tributaries on the Klamath, all significant to the tribes in the area. And for me, in my place, I'm from the Trinity River, which is the largest tributary on the Klamath, and is a really significant site for Hoopa people. So Klamath River as home, the tribes Hoopa, Yurok, Karuk, Shasta, and the Klamath tribes of the Klamath River and its tributaries, Trinity and Salmon rivers, depend on the basin for cultural and physical renewal. I really can't belabor that point more, and how important the river is to who we are as people. And fishing is a community event. Families fish for Chinook coho salmon, steelhead and coastal cutthroat trout, green and white sturgeon, and Pacific lamprey. And so there are also fishing sites, so family fishing holes. Like, I know where I'm from the Marshall family in Hoopa, so I know where that fishing hole is. And so we really situate ourselves around salmon, and salmon is everything, as I will talk about a little bit later. So this is Charlie's dad, Ron Reed, and this came from the, this came from the National Geographic article that Charlie was discussing. And so there's been a lot of focus on the Klamath River for a number of years. And I'll go into some of the advocacy work that's been happening on the Klamath for almost 20 years now. But the river is so significant, and so the Hoopa, Karuk, and Yurok activists have gone and to protect the rivers wherever there may be danger toward the river. And I'll talk a little bit about that. But as you can see here, here's some dip net fishing as Charlie was describing. And I really like this poem from Brian Tripp, who is a Karuk artist and a poet. Through my body flows blood of singers and dancers, makers of dance regalia, carvers and basket makers, gatherers, hunters, and fishermen, all believers in the traditional religion and the old ways. I know I am these people, and I have done all these things before many, many years ago. So we're a part of an unbroken line of people who have continued our ways of life despite genocidal violence from the state, from corporations that come in, ecological destruction. Gold mining was very destructive up in our area. And there were genocidal campaigns from the state of California to hunt us down, essentially, and through the state of California and federal government. But we have survived and continue on our lands. So language is also a very important part of thinking about land and space on the Klamath River. I'm kind of a horrible Hoopa linguist. I'm learning and I'm trying, but I haven't yet attempted to master this word, the longer word. But in the Hoopa language, the Trinity River is translated to as a power one should pray to. So it's a significant area. And then Hun refers to all other rivers. So the Trinity is really central to the Hoopa people. And so because I'm at the confluence of the American rivers and the Sacramento rivers, if I was, thinking in the Hoopa language and thinking of that river as Hun, it would always refer back to the Trinity River. So there, the rivers any river becomes as important as the Trinity River to Hoopa people. So in the early turn of the century, around the time that the Edward Curtis photograph is taken, there are several dam projects. The Klamath Hydroelectric Project was established in the Upper Klamath River system. And so you can see from the map, the Iron Gate Dam, Copco dams, and then J.C. Boyle Dam. So Copco 1 and 2 is constructed in 1917, 1925. Iron Gate and J.C. Boyle in 1958 and 1962. So it's a long hydroelectric project that the federal government adheres to, and the Pacific Corporation owns these dams, and I'll get into that in a little bit. And these dams were mainly used for hydroelectric power. So hydroelectric power servicing these areas. And then there's also the Klamath Irrigation Project, which diverts water from the Klamath River into farmlands in Southern Oregon. So problems on the Klamath River and its tributaries, because of this damming system and because of the irrigation system that we have on the Klamath now, water is often diverted to Southern Oregon for farming purposes. On the Trinity, you also see water diverted to the Central Valley Project. Down in Central and Southern California. And so you see this kind of pull for the Trinity River between Klamath River irrigation to Oregon and then Central Valley irrigation to the Central Valley. And so these dams create dangerous conditions on the Klamath River, toxic algae blooms, low water, hot water, salmon and fish species on the Klamath need cold water to survive. And so it creates these really dangerous conditions on the Klamath River. And in 2001, these conditions worsen on the Klamath River, and the coho salmon are on the Endangered Species Act list. And so the federal government decides that water will be released down to the lower Klamath to save those salmon species. Then they're in Southern Oregon at Klamath Falls. There's acts of civil disobedience from the Oregon farmers and the folks who needed irrigation in Southern Oregon. And so the federal government backs off, and it creates these dangerous conditions, diverts water to Southern Oregon farmers instead of lower Klamath River, and you get the Klamath River fish kill of 2002. And so I just trigger warning. I'm showing some photographs of salmon dead along the riverbanks. I always say that because it's hard for me to look at these photographs since there are more than human kin, but I want to give you the perspective of the devastation that occurred when that happened. So on September 19th, 2002, Yurok tribe, Karuk tribe, Hoopa tribe were getting reports of a salmon fish kill along the Klamath. And what makes it worse, this was during ceremonial time too. So tribes were conducting their ceremonies, and then they get information related to the salmon kill on the Klamath. And everybody that I've interviewed and talked to during this time say how devastating this really was. You know, it's like seeing your community and your family dead along the riverbanks, and it was catastrophic event. So I was a teenager when this happened. I had spent the summer prior in Hoopa with my family, and I remembered how hot and dry that year was. And then I remember really the devastation that we all felt when this occurred, and really seeing the things that happened on the Klamath. But it was the catalyst for a very strong grassroots advocacy movement from the tribes, the Hoopa, Yurok, Karuk, Klamath, Shasta tribes coming together and really organizing against both corporations that were responsible as well as federal and state government. So the Calamitous Justice Coalition. So I was fortunate enough to interview Leif Hillman, who is one of the, who's a Karuk tribal member and one of the leaders of the Calamitous Justice Coalition. And he said, you know, one day people went down to the riverbanks and started talking about what they can do and came up with this idea to go and to Pacific Corps headquarters. At that time, it was Scottish Power owned Pacific Corp and in Scotland. So they decided to send a group of Native people over, youth, adults over, elders over to protest Scottish Power and really fight to remove these dams on the Klamath. So it's a catalyst of a really strong grassroots advocacy movement. And I'm glossing over quite a bit here just for the sake of time. But Scottish Power then sells the company to Mid-American Energy, which was owned by Warren Buffett. And then Mid-American turns into Berkshire Hathaway Energy Corporation and still owns Pacific Corp to this day. So Warren Buffett is tied to the dams on the Klamath. So the Climate Justice Coalition, wherever this company goes, the Climate Justice Coalition goes too. So once the company is sold to Mid-American, there's protests that occur both in Portland, Oregon, and then Mid-American headquarters, and then Berkshire Hathaway headquarters, Nebraska. So there's a long tradition of going to Warren Buffett's house and protesting there, most recently in the last few months. Related to dam removal. And then Portland, Oregon. So there's been actions in Portland, Oregon, because that's where Pacific Corp is headquartered. California, so protesting at the Capitol, and then also at the Oregon State House as well. So the heart of the basin, Indigenous artists and activists in action. So a big part of my dissertation is looking at how activists and artists have used world renewal epistemologies and praxis to really combat these genocidal tactics of corporations in the state and towards water infrastructure projects, and really the way in which art has informed advocacy and how, you know, world renewal people are using their skills as artists to combat ongoing genocide on the Klamath. So this is just some art, some t-shirts that have come out of there. No amount of stalling will stop the dams from falling, from Analia Hillman. I love that. I love that piece of work. And then Lynn Risling too has contributed quite a bit to this. And then the left-hand side, Stop the Killing, Release the Trinity Flow. It's actually me wearing a shirt when we were protesting at the Bureau of Reclamation a few years ago. So Hupa Yurok and Karuk artist Julian Lang, who does quite a bit of language work with the Karuk people. We out in Shasta has been heavily involved in the advocacy, the arts advocacy movement. Lynn Risling, who I mentioned, Brian Tripp, whose beautiful poetry I share with you, and Brittany Britton. And so a lot of the art does center around the meaning of the river towards world renewal ideas, and then also a hope for the future for health of the river as well. So signage and ephemera of the Klamath. So many advocates come together to create signs, which I think is a really important part of art practice and grassroots advocacy. So on the left-hand side, you actually see from a day of action that we had on October 23rd, a digital day of action, also, you know, trying to be safe in these COVID-19 times. But yeah, a day of action on October 23rd. In the middle is Molly White, first the buffalo, now the salmon. It was in Portland. And then we recently had a partnership with Patagonia related to salmon restoration. And so we stand for the water, we stand. So Klamath River Basin poetry, performance, and literature. So a lot of literature, a lot of poetry, and a lot of performance has come out of the Klamath related to the issues surrounding water rights advocacy. So maybe some of you have seen, I think there's a lot of people here right now from the Pacific Northwest, but maybe you've seen Salmon is Everything, which is the community-based theater in the Klamath watershed about the Klamath River issues and the meaning of the Klamath to Hupa Yurok and Karuk tribal members. And then Shauna Oteka McCovey, who's a fantastic poet, has written quite a bit about living in you know, Karuk and Yurok homelands and the meanings of the river and traditions and the fight and struggle against cultural genocide. So this has been a near 20-year fight for justice on the Klamath River, 2002 to present. There's been ongoing and continued actions, Pacificorp and Warren Buffett's private residence, online letter writing calls to state agencies, so State Water Resources Control Board in California, the governor's office, both in Oregon and California, and protests at government offices. So it's really interesting because, you know, we'll get like, Facebook messages saying, well, we're going to be doing this action here at Bureau of Reclamation to get them to release water flows so that we can do our dances on the river, so that we can have enough flows for fisheries. But that's not a sustainable way of doing policy. Like we literally have to go almost every year to go protest and to get water flows going. And it's almost like clockwork that occurs. And so, and a lot of this has been on the onus and on the backs of Native people who have been fighting for river restoration for a very long time, even prior to 2002, and fighting for fishing rights, and the ability to fish without, you know, fear of game wardens or fear of violence from the state. We've also produced webinar series. So when I say we, I'm also talking as a board member of Save California Salmon. So definitely putting in a plug for Save California Salmon if you're interested in these types of issues on the Klamath. Webinar series, Mobilizing for Water Justice, organized by Save California Salmon and Humboldt State University's Native American Studies program. And youth actions and food sovereignty demonstrations. So a big part of also living on the Klamath is understanding how food really sustains us and how salmon really, really sustains us as people. So as a result of this advocacy, sorry, I was looking at the chat. As a result of this advocacy, the Klamath agreements are signed in 2010, and those agreements, the Klamath Basin Restoration Agreement (KBRA), was really innovative and looked for a design balance between water use, between environment and agriculture, fund fisheries restoration, improve irrigation infrastructure, provide economic development programs for local communities. So it was really looking holistically at the way in which, both sides, whether that be like Southern Oregon farmers who depend on agriculture for livelihood and tribes, would be able to come together towards an agreement on protecting the Klamath. Unfortunately, this agreement lapsed in 2015 when U.S. Congress failed to pass it, and it was blocked by more conservative members of Congress who tend to like dams more than other folks. And then so the Klamath Hydroelectric Settlement Agreement is signed in 2010, and it details the removal of the four Pacific Court hydroelectric dams on the Klamath. And then it was re-signed in 2016. So that's still in play right now. But Arnold Schwarzenegger was for the state of California, was the original signatory for these agreements. That's why I have a picture of him. So in November 17, 2020, a new Klamath Memorandum of Agreement was signed. And so Charlie alluded to this in his presentation, but an MOA is signed between Pacific Core, the states of Oregon and California, and the Karuk and Yurok tribes, and describes how the parties will implement the amended KHSA and address some of the concerns that FERC had related to ownership of the dams. So the MOA calls for Oregon and California to serve as the co-licensees with KRRC, which is Klamath River Restoration Corporation, allowing Pacific Core to transfer ownership and responsibility for dam removal to the dam removal entity, as called for in the KHSA. So that's all to say that, as Charlie mentioned, the dams are subject for removal in 2023, 2024 with this new agreement. And while it's really fantastic that we do have this new agreement and, people were able to come together to re-sign, I think there's a little bit of fatigue, at least from the communities up north who have for a very long time been fighting against this, almost 20 years. And the dams were supposed to be removed in 2020. It didn't happen. So I think there is a hopefulness that comes along with this kind of advocacy, but also kind of we'll believe it when we see it. So I took this picture on the day, so that's why it's a little blurry. But something I like to point out in relation to this event, that the only people who mentioned the grassroots advocacy efforts of tribes were the tribal chairmen. So Chairman James and then Chairman Atterbury. Chairman James is from Yurok and Chairman Atterbury is from the Karuk tribe. And really, really recognizing the role in which grassroots advocacy has played in forcing the state and these corporations to towards their responsibility on the Klamath River and the destruction that these dams really have caused over generations of people. And these agreements don't happen without the tribes and didn't happen without grassroots advocacy and artists and activists and people who saw a need to go and push for this dam removal. So the people of the Klamath River Basin, you might recognize this young gentleman here, Charlie Reed, with his dad, Ron, Analia, and then Molly White. So these are the people that have been involved for a very long time. I mean, Charlie's pretty young there. I was fairly young when the original fish kill occurred. And so it's a lifelong fight. And some people have passed on and haven't seen, the dams go down and the rivers return to the way that it was. And as Charlie mentioned before too, it's going to take a lot more work beyond the removal of the dams to restore the Klamath River to what it once was. But I think it's a work that is multi-generational and that many people are very dedicated to. So this is a picture at Native American Day. I just like the picture. This is all of us. It's all of my friends and family and relations as we like to demonstrate our culture at Native American Day and really show that we're still here, we're still around, we still practice our traditions, we still do the things that our ancestors taught us to do since time immemorial, and that we're a part of an unbroken line of people that really care and love their lands and are looking for them to be restored. Again, looking to combat against settler colonial violence that still occurs to us. I think that there's a tendency to not recognize that dams or water infrastructure or all these things that are for the greater good, that they're so environmentally terrible for tribes and really have taken a lot away from us. And so I always think, like, how much do we have to give for the greater good? Like, our generations of people gave their lives because of genocidal violence and the creation of the state. And I don't think that you can talk about the environment or river restorations or like any of the great projects that we want to see without recognizing the legacy of violence that we still live in. So on that note, that's my presentation. If you have any questions, you want to reach out, feel free to. My email's right here. And then I'm also on Twitter, so I just put my Twitter handle in case you want to see that. But thank you so much.
Thank you, Brittany. I think it was really a great reminder during your talk about the amount of time Indigenous peoples have been forced to spend their time asserting their rights and titles, be able to have their voice heard, and to be able to take that responsibility as caretakers of the land and water. And how much we kind of overlook the fact that if these barriers did not exist and protests were not necessary, there would be so much more opportunity for Indigenous people to spend time on the issues that need to be dealt with. It would just behoove us all if we could just focus on what the issues are instead of having to force some to fight just to get their voice heard. So I really appreciate your talk today and just the sheer amount of effort that it takes to kind of hold that ball and keep it running to protect something that's for the good of all. So that's it's kind of incredible. Thank you so much. We're going to kind of go into the panel Q&A session now. At this time, if all speakers could turn on their videos for the Q&A session, then we will start shooting stuff at you for questions. And then we'll be wrapping up at 4 o'clock on time. I think we're looking really great for that. My first question is for Robin. This one came in. Some restoration practitioners see a gravel bar as a desert, while others see it as an expression of the river and its geology, complete with a life that finds opportunities to exist there. How do we make decisions of what is a gift to the river? How do we give back? Plant the bars up with as many trees as possible and try to train the river, or recognizing some engineering can be the wrong gift and will not contribute to healing. Do you have an answer for one of our attendees on that?
I think what I would offer would be a reflection, not an answer, but from the perspective of engaging with the river as a living being with its own knowledge of how to be a river, I would trust the river on the dynamics, right? Oftentimes in restoration, we invest so much in saying, this is what we want the river to be like, or the land to be like, or the prairie to be like. And we get so invested in that we forget that it's a dynamic system and that it's always going to be changing and turning over and moving. So I think that that's part of the power of thinking about biocultural restoration, is that the relationship endures, but the actual composition of the place might change as it should.
Thank you so much. My next question is for Gabe. Sheoships. How can we, the larger community, support the infrastructure needed within Indigenous peoples so that the work of biocultural restoration can begin?
Good question. I would say that a renewed interest in sharing resources and truly co-managing, and even reflecting on what's the idea of management. Focusing less in the Columbia Basin, maybe on monitoring or contracting, or kind of going away from that linear system to, setting some new goals collaboratively. I think really assessing who holds the power, who has kind of shaped the land with their power, and, where it's gotten us. I think reflecting on power sharing, setting some new realistic goals, thinking kind of longer term, and looking beyond fiscal years. And what if we did? I mean, if we looked at every spring Chinook we put $1 on, it'd be worth more than a Tesla. We're really in a bad place. I think people don't realize that because they're not on the ground floor. They're not tribal fishermen. They're just, this world is so completely away from their everyday lives. I think many of us here, this is a life way, a passion, a spiritual connection. I think we know for the broad populace of the United States, it's probably not the same. So I'm rethinking that idea of stewardship as one of my board members, a couple of my board members, Gerard Rodriguez and Wilson Yee, would say it's an inherent ethic that we all need to undertake in this world. And it's not just on Indigenous peoples, but we all need to adopt this ethic. And now is the time, whether it's the thinking about the ecological balance or our general inherent safety, whether it's floods or fires, something has to change, and the environment is talking to us. Just not all of us can listen at the moment.
Thank you. It really reminds me, I remember having a discussion with friends about the fact that we often, as newcomers, talk about European ideas of long-term, how we make decisions, whether they're long-term or short-term, and if they are in regards to nature or not in regards to nature. And we kind of say, well, we come from our European background, but we've morphed so much now that it's just the North American background that thinks short-term versus long-term, and also does not always consider nature when there's sort of dollars to be made. Differently in Europe right now, Germany has a history of making long-term decisions. Sweden has a history of respecting nature far more than we do. So I think that we have to really look at ourselves very closely. So thank you so much for that.
I think a lot of those ideas, Carrie, were exported over here.
Yeah. I think this is the problem. There was I think the Indigenous groups did such an amazing job of taking care of so much of the space that when we showed up as newcomers, it looked like it was all here free and it wasn't being managed. We didn't realize that it was all being managed in such a way that there was something to take. And then we got greedy, terribly. So yeah, it's an interesting idea that we have to stop putting this stuff over there. It's now us, it's what we've done. My next question is for Charlie. How do we increase the public's cultural literacy of Indigenous Americans?
I think that's a really good question. I think that's kind of starts off like having a healthy relationship with native and non-native communities is just spreading awareness on, like, I think it starts just how we started off this panel today, just recognizing whose land that we occupy. I think is the first start, and then doing some research. And like, I think a lot of what I appreciate is when someone comes and is like, oh, I heard that the miners really wreaked havoc on your people. Like they already knew, rather than like, so what happened? Like you could tell that like they did their research. Like, how can we be support? Like, that's terrible. Like, I want to be an advocate. I want to be supportive of whatever you guys have going on. And that, I think that's like the most, like, yeah, I'm down to invest some energy and time if like you're obviously doing your due diligence and looking into it. So like just increasing that knowledge. And I think Gabe did a pretty good job of highlighting how important it is to talk about the colonial violence, because it definitely impacts how we view and manage and navigate the natural world today, because it's still there. There's pretty obvious residue of that. And so it's just getting in touch with those communities, because we all know that history books don't have that information accurately. I think there's a romanticization about it, and so that's where it could be really harmful. But doing quality research and getting in connection with local tribal folks is a really good start to kind of increase your knowledge in that way. I'm sure others have really great advice as well, but that's probably how I would answer that question.
Would anybody else on the panel like to add to that? It's that question was quite a reoccurring theme for almost all of the presentations.
I don't want to speak for Brittany, but something I loved in your presentation was the role of art in addressing exactly this question of enhancing people's literacy, but not just from an awareness of history and injustice and colonial violence, but addressing the heart, that it's really that the work of art and music in literature is to open the heart to others, and bridges some of that barriers to otherness. So I think that's a powerful way to enhance literacy. Art has to be a part of the work that we do.
Thank you. The next question was directed for Brittany. It acknowledges that much of the restoration planning surrounding the dam removal initiative on the Klamath is being done by outside contractors. And although tribal representatives have been part of these conversations, there have been many challenges in trying to ensure that there is achieving engagement with the tribes to make sure their interests are reflected within these plans. Do you have any advice on how restoration planning teams can do a better job of making the planning process more inclusive? Big question. How do you want to fix the world?
I don't know. I mean, I think that I don't want to say I don't know. I think it's with anything like related to non-native people and native people interacting with each other. One of the things on the Klamath, and I think across different indigenous nations too, is that we don't always get along or think the same way about how to do something. And that's you're not going to get like a monolithic, like this is what all these people think. And I think a part of it's something that you actually mentioned, Carrie, like a part of Western ways of doing projects like this or infrastructure projects or removal is this whole, we need to do it right away, really fast. And we need to do this consultation in 30 days. And 30 days is all we're going to give these tribes to consult with us. And that's not really having a holistic relationship with indigenous nations or indigenous people. It has to really be a spirit of collaboration between contractors, between the tribes too, working together towards something. And I see that a lot with the grassroots advocacy work that I, have been fortunate enough to be a part of. Like that happens quite a bit. I mean, people disagree, but there is a movement towards this dam removal effort. I think that tribes also, this is maybe an aside, are also often pigeonholed still as being stakeholders and not being, you know, an integral part of any project that is going on Indigenous lands. I think it's interesting that, like, I mean, it's probably because of my upbringing and, you know, being a Native person, but I always think about whose lands I'm on and where I'm at and how I'm supporting them and what, if I'm doing something proper, like what protocol is appropriate in the place that I'm at. But it's been pretty clear to me that that's not the case most of the time with non-Native people and contractors and government folks. So I would recommend, if you are doing this type of river restoration work, to start from that point. Whose land am I on? Like, who am I beholden to on this place? Like, how am I ensuring justice on Indigenous lands? I mean, I guess that's the best advice that I could give about that type of work.
That's lovely. Thank you. Robin, another question for you. What can Indigenous knowledge offer us in our responses to climate change when historical reference ecosystems may no longer fare well where they once existed? What would be a First Nations approach to such a large-scale pervasive change?
Great question. You know, I think by virtue of the language that has been attached to Indigenous ways of knowing, by calling it traditional ecological knowledge, that tends to keep it sort of static in the past, right? And it's what people used to do. And we hold on to that as a reference point, when traditional ecological knowledge is a way of being, it's a way of learning, it's a way of adapting. And so I think the important thing is to realize that that nature is going to be a moving target, right? It always is, but particularly in a time of accelerating climate change. So what matters are the principles of how to learn from the land, how to adapt, how to guide your actions by respect and reciprocity. To me, that's at the heart of the knowledge. I think about my own people who, in a sense, I think of it as suffering climate change in a single year, when our people were removed from our Great Lakes homes to the prairies of Kansas. How did they survive? Were the plants that they always relied on still there? Nope. Did the rivers work the same way? Nope. Everything was different. So do we say, well, their traditional knowledge was useless? No, because the traditional knowledge is what allowed them to learn and adapt and learn from the plants and animals and rivers and one another. So I think it's really important to broaden what we think about as traditional knowledge as not equivalent to scientific data, but equivalent to a way of learning. And that way of learning is where resilience for climate change lives. You know, if we think about the longevity of our people on Turtle Island, we've been through many, many climate changes. Our Anishinaabe people have stories of the ice, of the ice walls, of the glaciers. We have adapted to many climate changes, and it is the resilience of people's ways of being and thinking that become an inestimable tool for adaptation.
Thank you. You all inspire me so much. I have one last question, just because I really, really want to ask it, even though we're getting kind of close to the end. And I'd like to ask Gabe of this. What considerations do you feel are most important to protect the intellectual property of Indigenous knowledge? Is there ways we can build in protection so that it can't be misconstrued, misinterpreted, colonialized?
That's a great question. I'd love to hear from the fellow panelists. But I think when you ask that question, you have to you have to take a deep dive into the history of not of kind of colonization, but also cultural appropriation. And I think we see this much, pretty often today in the 21st century, but there's a long history in a short time of appropriation, and tribes and tribal people have really been holding on to what remains. And so whether it's river restoration, cultural gathering, usual and accustomed fishing and hunting, here in the Northwest, huckleberries are a big issue. But there's really, what we say is you go about things in a good way. What's in your heart for why you're seeking this knowledge? Is it for personal gain? Is it for, are you looking to make a profit? There's so many things that go into it. This is a hugely wide question, and one that's very relevant. I think, in a perfect world, one would, a lot of this information that was described today, these lifeways, these values, would be in our public schools. But I think we know for years our story has been misrepresented and predominantly omitted from our public school system, from our K through 12 system. And when we are portrayed, it's inaccurate or written by somebody else. So all of these different things play into one another. And I think it's really place-based and dependent on what the what the information is, or what the resource would be disseminated. It really depends on. I think that it'd be hard to lay a broad statement down, but if we have time, I'd be curious to others' thoughts. I know we're at the time here.
Yeah, I'm afraid I'm running terribly out of time though. You guys didn't, I did. So just to close up today, thank you, limb to all of our presenters for sharing your knowledge. Limb to the attendees today for joining us. My mother-in-law is also a residential school survivor. She lectures her grandchildren on the value of sharing their knowledge. But she also lectures them on how to pay respect for those that have shared knowledge with us. And I think we have a kind of a strong history of listening but not hearing. So to wrap up this event with a kind of call to action, as a means not only to process what we've heard today, but also to pay respects for people that have shared their information and their knowledge. In the chat line, please let us know what ideas have evoked for you today, based on the knowledge shared in the presentations. Maybe this means doing a little bit of further research. Maybe it means identifying what your colonial history actually is for your area. Maybe it's finding ways to create a new opportunity that has been identified as lacking. Maybe it's communing with nature. Let's keep finding ways to make space for these discussions and the actions that can follow. I understand the River Restoration Northwest is planning on follow-up events. They'll post those on their website. And the chat line for our call to action was going to remain open for an additional 15 to 20 minutes for those particularly deep thinkers. And with this, to keep some time, into 2021, everybody be kind, be safe, take care, and Nch'i Salawikinshin. We will see you later. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.